So one of my bizarre family night memories is watching the Miss America pageant, which was a really big deal at our house and sort of almost a religious thing, circling the TV guide and all that. And that's what this poem is about. But it's also it's really about seeing little Ricky, me, sort of navigating between these two worlds, between these two mythic worlds, or between his mythic America and sort of the reality of his family, and how they're two different perceptions of America, looking at this as we're watching the Miss America pageant in a crazy sort of family Blanco night, if you will. So, it's called Betting on America. My grandmother was the bookie. Sat up at the kitchen table that night, her hair in curlers, pencil and pad, jotting down $2 bets, paying 5 to 1 on which Miss would take the crown that year. Abuelo put all his money on Miss Wyoming. She's got great teeth, he pronounced, as if complimenting a horse. Not her smile filling the camera before she whisked away like a cloud in her creamy chiffon dress. I dug up enough change from my sofa and car seats to bet on Miss Wisconsin, thinking I was as American as she because I was as blonde as she was, and I knew that's where all the cheese came from. That wasn't all. Chocolate was from Miss Pennsylvania. The capital of Miss Montana was Helena. Mount Rushmore was in Miss South Dakota. And I knew how to say Miss Connecticut, unlike my tia Gloria, who just pointed at the TV. Esa, her, that one, claiming she had her same figure before leaving Cuba. It's true, es verdad. I have pictures, she declared, before cramming another bocadito sandwich into her mouth. Papa refused to bet on any of the misses because Americanas all have skinny butts. He complained, there's nothing like a big culo cubano. And everyone agreed, es verdad, es verdad. Except for me and my little cousin Julito, who apparently was a breast man at age 5. Reaching for Miss Alabama's bosom on the screen, the leggy mulata sashaying in pumps and swimsuits, seducing Tio Pedro into picking her as the sure winner. She's the one. She looks cubana, he swore. And she did, but she cost him $5. Cojone, he exploded as confetti rained down. Bert Parks leading Miss Ohio, the new Miss America, by the hand to the runway. Gloves up to her elbows, velvet down to her feet, crying diamonds into her bouquet, the queen of our country, of our land of the free, floating amid the purple mountains of her majesty across the stage and our living room, though no one bet on her, and none of us, not even me, could answer Mama when she asked, Chico, where is Ohio? And when the White House called, and I don't know if everyone knows this, but they asked me to write 3 poems, not one, 3 poems in 3 weeks. I'm not sure why they made the Cuban write 3 poems, but they did. And so for the third poem, I turned to my mother's journey. For another reason that I hadn't realized was that my mother's story is not just about loss and longing and despair, and it wasn't just about courage, but it was also about faith. And it was about the faith she must have had in this country to help her make that leap, right? That leap of faith. And so this poem, in a way, asks those same questions of home through my mother's story, asks us to think about our own home, our own country through my mother's eyes or through my mother's emotional shoes. Imagining if you had to sort of get up from these seats and pack one suitcase and leave, as my mother did, everything you ever known behind. And how might that help us to rethink our own relationship with the United States, with America? How might that help us appreciate the good and not throw it out with the bathwater? And how might we engage more actively with our country to make sure that we are participating in a way that so we won't lose this country in our sense. So yeah, so this is sort of what this poem is trying to do. And that's her with me at the inauguration. She's the one who was sitting next to me. And in some ways, my mother for that single act of faith. In some ways, my mother, I feel, should have been the one to read that poem in Washington, not me. I don't deserve that honor. I think she is more of an American than I could ever be for that act of faith. Mother country, madre patria. To love a country as if you've lost one. 1968, my mother leaves Cuba for America, a scene I imagine as if standing in her place, one foot inside a plane destined for a country she knew only as a name, a color on a map, or glossy photos from drugstore magazines. Her other foot anchored to the platform of her patria, her hand clutched around one suitcase, taking only what she needs most. Hand-colored photographs of her family, her wedding veil, the doorknob of her house, a jar of dirt from her backyard, goodbye letters she won't open for years. The sorrowful drone of engines, one last deep breath of familiar air she'll take with her. One last glimpse at all she'd ever known. The palm trees wave goodbye as she steps onto the plane. The mountains shrink from her eyes as she lifts off into another life, to love a country as if you've lost one. I hear her. Once upon a time, reading picture books over my shoulder at bedtime, both of us learning English, sounding out words as strange as the talking animals and fair-haired princesses in their pages. I taste her first attempts at macaroni and cheese, but with chorizos and pepper. And her shame over Thanksgiving turkeys, always dry but countered by her perfect pork pernil and garlic yuca. I smell the rain of those mornings, huddled as one under one umbrella, waiting for the bus to her 10-hour days. And at night, the zzz, zzz of her sewing her own blouses and quinceañera dresses for her grown nieces, still in Cuba, guessing at their sizes. And the gowns she sell to neighbors to save for a rusty white sedan, no hubcaps, no air conditioning, sweating all the way through our first vacation to Florida theme parks, to love a country as if you've lost one. As if it were you on a plane departing from America forever. Clouds closing like curtains on your country, the last scene in which you're a madman scribbling the names of your favorite flowers, trees, and birds you'd never see again. Your address and phone number you'd never use again. The color of your father's eyes and your mother's hair, terrified you could somehow forget these. To love a country, as if I was my mother last spring, hobbling, insisting I help her climb all the way up to the U.S. Capitol, as if she were here before you today instead of me, explaining her tears, her cheeks pink as the cherry blossoms coloring the air that day, when she stopped, turned to me, and said, "You know, mijo, I've been thinking, it isn't where you're born that matters. It's where you choose to die. That's your country." Interesting question, no? We don't always get to choose. We don't get to choose where we're born unless we're knocking out, let me out. But for the most part, figuratively and literally, we do get to choose where we die. And it asks us that eternal question, that really important question about home. Where is our final resting place? And what does really home, makes us think about what home means and where our loyalties are and where our lives are. And in my mother's case, she's gotten to a point where she's lived more years in the United States than she has ever in Cuba. And she will be buried here next to my father, next to her husband, unfortunately next to her mother-in-law as well, which you'll meet later if you haven't already in other writings of mine. But yeah, okay. So the other thing, this is my father, There's a few characters there. My father, my brother, of course, and myself as a toddler. I was chubby there, and the infamous plastic-covered sofa, which I always tell people in Maine. It's one thing to have a plastic-covered sofa in Maine. It's another one to have a plastic-covered sofa in Florida in July, where you get up, but your skin doesn't. So. This poem is not about the plastic-covered sofa, though I've been threatening to write an ode to the plastic-covered sofa in the style of Neruda. It's really about my engineering and my father and my poetry. I still get asked that question all the time, like, you're an engineer and a poet, in the spirit of interdisciplinary, what we're talking, what Ellen was saying. I mean, it's sort of amazing that we still sort of think of our world this way as if, I mean, I get it, as careers are totally different. I get I'm left brain, right brain. But it's more complex than that. And for years, I sort of felt that I couldn't do anything creative because I was an engineer. And sort of for years, I sort of led this life of sort of engineer by day and sort of secret poet by night. All those worlds sort of did start to come together. And I realized there were all these amazing overlaps. In the last maybe 15 or 20 years, I started specializing in city planning and in urban town development. In fact, I was in the planning board at Bethel. They had no idea I was a poet when they let out the news. It was hilarious. Like, Richard's a poet. But the idea was that I was sitting in a room like this and asking people, what is home, right? And translating what that meant, what that vision, that collective mission meant, which is really a very emotional process, into brick and mortar, right? Into parks and streets and landscaping and sidewalks, and what does home look like for us as a community? It's something I think that Maine in general, many communities in Maine are going through, right? As there's so many changes happening so fast. I know we're doing that in Bethel. So as an engineer, I realized that that obsession of home was coming through in the sense that I was as an engineer, I was involved in the physical or the landscape or the physical representation of home, and as a poet, I was involved with the psychological representation of home. But that these two things have a really important relationship. The physical landscape is always overlaid by an emotional landscape. Everything that we experience in life, we experience in place and in home and belonging. What does that mean? So what happens when the physical landscape doesn't match the emotional landscape, and how do these two things sort of jive together? And that's sort of what I'm shooting for in this poem. The physical landscape is Miami, and the emotional landscape is my relationship with my father. It takes place on a bridge that I ended up working on as an engineer later on. But it was a bridge that I took every morning to work to my engineering office. And I guess the only thing you need to know here, on one side is a civic center, which are a series of hospital complexes, and the other side is sort of the Miami skyline. Papa's Bridge. Morning, driving west again, away from the sun rising in the slit of the rearview mirror. As I climb on slabs of concrete and steel bent into a bridge, arcing with all its parabolic Y squared splendor. I rise to meet the shimmering faces of buildings above treetops meshed into a calico of greens. Forgetting the river below runs, insists on running and scouring the earth, moving it grain by grain. And if only for a few inclined seconds every morning, I am 12 years old again, with my father standing at the 10th floor window of his hospital room, gazing back at the same bridge like a mammoth bone aching with the gravity of its own dense weight. The glass dosed by a tepid light reviving the city as I watched and read his sleeping, wondering if he could even dream in such dreamless white. Was he flying? Was he falling? Was he flying? Was he falling? Who was he? Who was I underneath his eyelids, flitting like the birds across rooftops, the early morning stars wasting away? The rush hour cars pushing through the avenues like the tiny blood cells through his vein. The IV spiraling down like a string of clear licorice feeding his forearm, bruised pearl and lavender colors of the morning haze, and the pills on his tongue. The stitches healed, while the room kept sterile with the usual silence between us. For 3 days, I served him water or juice in wilting paper cups, flipped through muted soap operas and game shows, filled out the menu card stamped bland diet. For 3 nights, I wedged flat, strange pillows around his bed, his body shaped like a fallen S, mortared in place by layers of stiff percale. When he was ordered to walk, I took his hand. Together, we stepped to the window, and he spoke. Mijo, you'll know how to build bridges like that someday. Today, I cross this city, this bridge again, still spanning the silent distance between us, with the memory of a father and son holding hands and secretly in love. Thank you.